Tim Steggeis. Read by YOB. The Role of a Leader. Part 1. Goblin Intrigue. Chunk and Quag were plotting a murder. There's nothing special about that. Goblins plot murders every day. But Chunk and Quag were plotting the murder of Gorgel, their aged chief. Not for profit or power, but because Gorgel had humiliated the goblins by agreeing to the humans' treaty forcing the goblins to stay in the swamps. Back then, they had been fighting their way to the sea, where their pirate allies were supposed to meet them. This should have made the goblins invincible. Well, at least powerful enough to raid the human farms and towns without the humans interfering. It was a necessary move to ensure their rights to plunder the local farms and villages. After all, how else were the goblins supposed to feed their families and get ahead? Then their stupid chief gets frightened by some riffle-raffle armies he failed to plan for, and signs a treaty that says they cannot leave the swamps, let alone raid for their victuals. The swamps were not a place known for their fine food and easy living. What crops they managed to grow were too little and too poor to feed the growing population of goblins. And now the ogres were living here as well. They had been sent to the swamps to aid the goblins in their campaign to reach the sea, but the treaty bound the ogres here, and they could not leave. Ogres eat a lot. The wild roots and berries that had otherwise helped fill in the difference from what the goblins grew in their fields and what they ate, now went into ogre bellies. The ogres were able to catch fish and eels to eat, but they did not share these with the goblins. Goblins did not know how to catch fish, and could only build traps and hope that they could eat what they caught. Snapping turtles often raided these traps and destroyed them. Goblins were starving. But if Chief Gorgel was gone, the treaty was no longer something they had to keep. They could raid the farms and towns as in the past, and there would be enough food again. Also, Quag was one of the contenders for the newly opened position of tribal witch doctor. Chief Gorgel favored another goblin, so the decision made itself. Chief Gorgel must be made to die. It was time to do what had to be done. But how were they to make it look like an accident? After all, he was their chief. They owed him that much respect. Nor did either of them relish being killed for murdering their chief. They had decided that the best thing would be for the chief to fall into deep water. He was old and often gasped for breath. The chief would not have the strength to pull himself out of the swamp and would drown. But it must look like he fell. His big bodyguards were still loyal and would try to avenge him. Quag led them in a prayer for guidance from Glindag, the imperious god of all things valued by goblins. They promised much spilled blood if the battle went to the sea again as possible. Quag pointed out that if they had more food, they could offer more to Glindag. A while later, as he was walking along the muddy bank of the local swamp, Quag saw a small bit of floating bark. It drifted into a rock that proved to be a snapping turtle. The turtle promptly overturned the little raft and snapped at it. Quag used a fallen branch to catch the turtle and take it back to the village. As he and Chunk shared an invigorating bowl of turtle stew, Quag shared his inspiration with him. They needed to find a reason why Chief Gorgel should visit an island out in the big swamp. Then they could sabotage the raft and have it fall to pieces, with the chief out in deep water. If they could make it look like a big turtle caused the accident, everyone would be free of blame, and they could start convincing the tribe that an attack on Bokenshire was in order. They would once again fight for a road to the sea and their pirate allies. This time they would not let the humans get in their way. Their opportunity came when the little island that Bordek the ogre lived on began to sink. It was slow at first, but it began to be more noticeable, and the island was sinking faster. Bordek sent a messenger to ask Gorgel if Bordek and his family could move into goblin territory. Gorgel said that Bordek would have to help with finding food and tribal defense. Bordek agreed, and Gorgel sent a day when they would meet and make the agreement official. The chief's raft was always rickety and weak, but Chunk went out one night and removed much of the bindings, making it even weaker. He had found the rotted remains of an eel, and now he tied bits of the pungent meat to the remaining lacings to attract turtles. The little meat that was left, he and Quag sacrificed to Glindag. The route to the island went through some deep water, and Quag prayed to Glindag that the accident would happen there. On the agreed-on morning, Gorgel and his bodyguards boarded the raft and set out for Bordek's island. The raft creaked and flexed dangerously, but that was normal. The bodyguards pulled the raft further out into the murky water. Bits of floating debris pushed out ahead of them. Quag and Chunk were among those present to watch the chief set off for the distant island. The raft suddenly lurched to one side as it struck something under the water. The occupants stumbled, but regained their footing, the bodyguards helping the old chief. Quag began to worry that the raft would fail too early, and they would have to save their chief. The raft was corrected, and the chief and his party continued to move further out into the swamp. Just as they were almost out of sight beyond the drowned scrub, the raft jerked violently, broke into pieces, and the chief was thrown into the muddy water. All of the goblins on the shore jumped in to save their chief, some more enthusiastically than others. The chief floundered and grasped at part of the shattered raft as his bodyguards attempted to help him. He screamed and raised one flabby arm with a huge turtle attached near his wrist. Some of the goblins from the shore were closing in on the scene now. The bodyguards lifted the old goblin onto a large piece of the raft. Chunk quietly cursed as it looked as if they would save their chief. Quag hushed him, as the other goblins might hear it and grow suspicious. A goblin with a knife pried the jaws of the turtle open and pulled the chief's arm free. At this point, the chief gasped, twisted in pain as he clutched his chest. All the goblins present were now pulling and pushing to get the wreckage back onto solid ground as the chief gave one last heaving gasp and stopped breathing. It was done. The chief was dead. It all looked like the result of the raft failing and the chief's old heart giving out. There was even a handy turtle to blame. The next day, as the council met to decide what to do about the death of their chief, Quag jumped up and shouted that if they had gotten the road to the sea like they had wanted, none of this would have happened. The Speaker of the Council said that such things were beyond their concern now, as the treaty forbade them from attacking Bokenshire, Thanet, or Korpan. They needed to find a new chief and solve the problems in front of them, instead of those behind them. Quag pointed out that both the ogre's former chief and now Gorgel were dead, so the treaty was no more. Also, since the treaty kept them from getting their needs through the traditional raids, the problem of the treaty was indeed in front of them. The goblins on the council were well aware of the food shortages and the lack of tradable wealth that plagued the swamp goblins. They also knew that many goblins itched to go raiding again, to improve their lot. In only minutes, they decided that the time was right to resume their battle to reach the sea. Bordek was there, and they asked him to approach the ogres and find out if they wanted to renew the battle so they might earn some booty and regain their right to travel where they wished. Bordek said that he would ask his people what they wanted to do. The goblins began going through all the old weapons and other junk to arm themselves. Much of it was fashioned from bark and tree roots. Snapping turtle shells made good helmets, and so were stolen and restolen. The goblins reassured themselves that this time they would be victorious. The ogres decided that what they most wanted was to get free of the swamps and their goblin neighbors. They would fight until they could demand free passage back to their old mountain caves and valleys. They wrenched up suitable trees to use as maces and clubs and stood ready. The Goblin Council decided that the close of summer would give the greatest opportunity for spoils and food. The humans would start bringing in their crops and would not yet have sealed them up in the guarded vaults of the larger towns. Chunk encouraged the council to choose the river Tenagor as their route to the sea. The council responded by making Chunk a general and telling him to lead the goblins down the river Tenagor if he knew so much. The first few days of the battle were successful. They raided many farms and 3 towns before the humans realized that the treaty was no more. The outlying farms provided ample rations and trade goods for them, as well as some better weapons in the form of bronze reaping sickles, axes, and knives. The soldiers ate better than they had in many seasons. Morale was up, and they were making good progress down the river when they met General William and his army. General Chunk sent a scout ahead to locate their pirate allies and tell them if they attacked General William from the rear now, they could win the day and had the river as their highway to the swamp and the interior. The scout soon stumbled into a group of dwarves who were observing for the Grey Forge Kingdom. The goblin scout vanished from history. With ogres in the lead ranks and goblins trying to outflank his forces, General William was vexed in his attempts to keep the battle from spreading into surrounding farms and villages. So he sent word to the new Menodoc Circle of Heroes for assistance. The circle was not staffed for this kind of response, and most of the heroes were off on other adventures. So the message was sent out to all the thrones of Menodoc for advice and assistance. King Mathrin sent his gnomes and archers to form a barrier to the north. King Buford sent ships to the mouth of the Tenagor and began assembling more men. King Nicholas dispatched General Sard and as many men as could be spared to come to the aid of the frustrated General William. The Reverend Mother sent a full choir of Corpon's healers to see to the healing needs of the men. King Geoffrey was once again engaged in driving out some renegade grolls from Tudun. King Valon said that he was coming, but would not get there for weeks. Lady Wendy and Tennard, who had been assisting King Valon, were coming with him. King Thuril was assembling his men and would send them once his ships could be launched. General Sard had been in the city Tai when the order came and was the first to reinforce the men of General William. He was met by a group of ogres who promised to withdraw if they could return to their old homes north of Corpon. Sard, for his part, felt like this was a fair proposal if he could make certain that the ogres did not attempt a deception under cover of their retreat. So he sent Captain Fell, an old friend, to meet the eastern edge of the goblin army and drive them back to the swamps. General Sard and the rest of his army would supervise the removal of the ogres. Soon reports came to General Sard of thefts and disagreements within Captain Fell's command. Several runners from both the captain and the healers reported that Fell had driven off his lieutenants and several other men as cowards. Both Captain Fell and the priestess Debrina accused each other of being thieves. Both of these people were old friends of Sard's, and he dreaded the thought of having to decide where the truth lay. He could only hope that it was a case of each misunderstanding the other. Part 2. Debrina. Debrina woke up angry. This Captain Fell of House Bram was a veritable pustule of ignorance and haughtiness. She had begun to think that she was wrong in believing that all men were fools. Then she had been assigned to this campaign against the Goblin Rebellion and met Captain Fell. This man was the most arrogant and foolish man she had ever met. He believed that all women were meant as wives, and those who chose a different path should be treated as whores. He in fact said so. He required that Debrina and her perverted priestesses stay out of sight of his men unless they were needed for healing. They were to march a full half-mile behind the company, so as not to corrupt my men. Bastard, a word she had picked up from General Sard. Fortunately, Debrina's reputation as a warrior and as a priestess kept her healers in fair morale and allowed the goblins little opportunity to overwhelm them. Oh, and another thing about this Captain Fell. He was a thief. The pay chest for the men he had commanded had been coming up short, and he had accused the healers of the theft. "Everyone knows that wars are thieves," he said. "I'll send to the House of Healing for compensation for what you and your healers have taken." Sabrina knew her people, and knew that his accusations were false. Captain Fell had changed the guard, and added chains to the chest to make it proof against "those warring thieves." Sabrina knew that she and her healers had not touched the pay chest. The few alternative suspects were soon eliminated. That left Captain Fell as the only plausible suspect. A few of his men had voiced disagreement about his view of the healers. He had run them off as cowards. This would be reported back to General Sard and ruin their reputations. Sabrina had exchanged letters with General Sard and explained what she had witnessed. Sard had responded that she must be mistaken, as Captain Fell was an old friend of his, and he was reputable and fair. Sabrina had replied that they must be talking about two different men, as the Captain Fell that she knew bore no likeness to the one that Sard described. Sard promised a full investigation just as soon as the Goblin campaign ended. Yes, Sabrina was angry. She had sent a similar report back to the Reverend Mother and had been advised to be patient. The messages coming back to Captain Fell about his request for compensation demanded proof of his accusations. He had responded with further claims of immoral behavior and renewed his demand. Would Sabrina live to an old age before she saw justice? Being angry is not good for a priestess, especially one who's just been promoted to High Priestess of the Second Choir of Field Healers, a very high honor that Sabrina was not certain that she wanted. It did entitle her to a pair of acolytes who assisted her, as well as 20 temple guards, but she could not allow even them to see a display of anger. She knelt on her pallet to pray, and soon felt better. Now she could face her healers and feel that she was setting a good example. The sun was coming up, and just as it was a half-dome against the horizon in the east, the goblins attacked. The healers could hear sounds of battle and the battle cries of the goblins. As the goblins were not yet attacking the healers' camp, they took a quick breakfast because they felt it would be a long day. Sabrina choked down some wetted ship's biscuit and a rock-hard piece of dried fish. She refused to eat any better than her healers, despite her rank. The order to come and administer healing finally came, and they proceeded to the site of the attack. The men of Captain Fell had managed to push the goblin army away from the river and back towards the swamp, but it was slow and tedious work. The goblins wanted to reach the sea, and they were willing to fight for it. The goblins may not have won the day, but they sure made a mess of the soldiers' camp. Several men were down, and the captain ordered the healers to "get these laggards on their feet, and then take your wars and be gone." Ah, yes, the captain was as charming as ever. The guard stood to keep watch for trouble as Sabrina and her healers did their work and offered more prayers for all these men, whole, wounded, or dead. 2 men whispered earnest apologies for the captain's foul behavior. It was good to know that not all of his men were swayed to the captain's view. Captain Fell strode by and shouted, "You are done now! Leave, and don't steal anything else!" In fact, they were done, and they were leaving. Sabrina had to silence one of her healers, who would have answered back to this foul man. "Shush," she whispered. "It will only provoke him and solve nothing. Instead, we shall behave in a manner that proves our superiority over such men." The woman stayed in ranks, but was obviously irritated. How could one blame her? Once back in their camp, Sabrina had all of her healers join her in prayer and meditation to calm and rejuvenate them. Hathor's blessings aided them in forgiving and dismissing the captain, but they all knew that this man would continue to harass and belittle them until they could be rid of him. Suddenly, and quite unexpectedly, they were rid of him. 8 days later, Just as the tide of battle was quickening and the men of Tor were defeating this force of goblins, the captain was down by a goblin arrow. This was unusual and unexpected, as goblins were reputed to be useless as archers, and the chroniclers speculated that it was a random shot that fell got in the way of by chance. Dobrina believed that it was Hathor's judgment come to pass. The difficulty lay in the fact that all of Fel's lieutenants were among those driven off as cowards. The men now had no leader. The only person of rank among them was Dobrina. The goblins had fallen back, but were no longer in retreat. If they knew that the men had no leadership, they would turn around and overwhelm them. Many would die if they could not prevent this. If they were to survive, they needed a leader immediately. So the men humbled themselves, and a group of them approached Dobrina and asked her to take the position of commander, to lead them and drive the goblins back in retreat. What could she do? Dobrina agreed, and in her shiny chainmail, Korpan's flag flying, she led a charge to keep the goblins in retreat, break their morale, and finish the battle. The soldiers obeyed, and the goblins fled south towards their companions, engaging General William's men. Dobrina sent a messenger to warn General William of the changes, and pursued the goblin horde while sending a measure of her men around to give the impression of another command of soldiers pursuing them from the east. This, she calculated, would keep the goblins from trying to outflank her men. 3 days later, the goblins rejoined their fellows, and Dobrina's men faced a much larger force. She regrouped her men, and Dobrina called her best men and the temple guards into council to plan their next tactic. General Sard sent word that reinforcements were coming. Captain Harvey was detached from General Sard's force in the north to come to her relief, but he would take days to reach Dobrina. Sard asked that she try to hold on, as they needed her position in the swamp. Dobrina promised to keep her men in this location and see that the goblins gained no advantage over General William. Remembering something that the gnome Smoke had once told her about keeping your enemy unsure of how many were in your group, she sent several men out to gather up such bits of armor as had escaped the usual field scavengers. They returned with mostly torn sections of padded armor, but put what they had to use. She also sent a priestess to talk the scavengers into camping with her men for protection. While the goblins were still disorganized and not in ranks, her men cut trees and set up posts throughout their camp and along the line of defense they had drawn. Rags and as much armor as could be found were attached to these to simulate soldiers. The scavengers milling about the camp sometimes got in the way, but goblin scouts would report an increase in the forces they had to face. It was a ruse. It worked. The goblins had received word that reinforcements were being sent to Dobrina's position, and the seeming increase told them that the reinforcements had arrived early. The goblins arrayed themselves for defense rather than attack and held their position. Dobrina and her men kept up the ruse for the 5 days it took for Captain Harvey and his men to arrive. Captain Harvey was amazed to see the way that Dobrina had kept the goblins at bay. He and his men found much humor in it. Soon King Balan and the heroes arrived, pushing the goblins from the west. Men from Luffa came up from Greatport to reinforce General William's men. Part 3. Query and Investigation. Together, Dobrina and Captain Harvey held the corner of the swamp against any outbreak of the goblins, and General William pushed the main force further and further back until the goblin commander cried out for mercy. The two generals met to discuss the terms of surrender.
"We goblins want a road to the sea for fresh sea air,"
General Chunk said. "Sea breezes go where they will," said General William. "A road will not alter their course and bring them into the swamps."
"But the swamps are so foul,"
complained General Chunk. "Try bathing," said General William without a smile.
"We need salt,"
said Chunk. "The rocks on the western edge of the swamps are full of salt," said General William, "as are the hickory trees that grow there. Get your salt from these."
"But sea salt is better,"
complained Chunk. "You can trade for it then," replied William.
We want fresh fish, said Chunk, once again changing his story. The fish in the swamps are sickly and do not taste good.
You have eaten them for generations, answered William. What has changed? The argument went on for 2 days, with General Chunk perpetually changing his demands and altering his story. A report came in that a pirate ship was sighted off the coast. Circan vessels drove it away. What do you know about pirates lurking off our coast? Asked General William.
What are pirates?
Asked General Chunk, with an unconvincing display of innocence. I think you are lying, said General William, finally losing his patience. You mean to join with these pirates and raid our farms and villages, just as you did in the past?
How dare you accuse us like this?
Shouted Chunk. Because we have defeated you, and we know goblins' habits, said William, with a slow return to patience. Your people have a well-known history. While the generals were discussing the terms of surrender, Smoke the Gnome arrived with a party of gnomish specialists, purportedly to assess the situation and give strategic information to General William and General Sard. Debrina well knew that at least part of Smoke's mission here was to investigate her accusations against Captain Fell. Smoke was now a high-ranking member of the Menadoc Circle of Heroes and was called on to obtain credible information concerning subjects of political intrigue or military interest. One of Debrina's men whispered that General Sard had specifically recommended Lieutenant Fell to be promoted to captain and assigned to his command. He would be embarrassed to find that the man had been false. Although she was not supposed to know what was being investigated, Debrina's newfound respect from her acquired command allowed her covertly whispered information. Many men were quietly questioned as to Captain Fell's character and behavior. The captain's body and belongings were thoroughly searched. While the captain's foul behavior was easily confirmed, the evidence of his being a thief was longer in coming. The only clue was a key that he had kept on his person that did not fit any of the locks in the camp. By itself this proved nothing. Then gnomish scouts found suspicious tracks near the camp where Captain Fell had been shot. They followed the tracks and discovered a locked chest hidden under a wind-fallen log. The captain's key fit this lock, confirming his crimes. Most of the missing silver was found within. Then Smoke officially informed Debrina of his findings. I rather suspected this, said Smoke, but I did not wish to tell General Sard that he had been deceived. You were not there, but when the Saurian Heket interviewed us, Sard used the word mark to say that he had been ill-used. It is a word coined in the Thieves' Guild, and not much used elsewhere. When I asked Sard where he had heard it, he said that Lieutenant Fell had used it often. I was not certain then, but I am now. Lieutenant Fell was the thief that had Sard arrested in his place. I will have to inform Sard of this in the gentlest of words, as he will be very disappointed. Part 4. Heroism. It sticks to your face. A new twist came when Debrina assembled her soldiers and told them that they could join Captain Harvey's command and return to normal, honorable service. Almost to a man, they respectfully requested to continue serving under her. Debrina was flustered and surprised. How was a healer to be in command of these men? In the end, they were ordered by General Sard to join under Captain Harvey's command. But later, General Sard informed her that because a method had been tried and found to serve, she might find herself asked to command armed men in the future. But I command healers, not fighting men, said Debrina. How am I to be asked to command? For my first point, said Sard, you are clearly an able leader. It is the moral obligation of an able leader to lead those who need leading. Debrina said nothing, and Sard continued. For my next point, you now have a reputation amongst men as an able leader. This means that your presence may help keep soldiers in good morale and focused on their tasks. This will save lives, which is your calling as a healer. Debrina drew in a breath. He had her solidly to rights with that remark. For my third point, Sard went on, this is not the first time men have gathered to you in battle. Remember Gorse Crossing and the farm? Was not Lady Spoven the leader they gathered to? Asked Debrina. How long were they fighting before Lady Windy joined you? Countered Sard. Perhaps an hour, conceded Debrina. An hour in which wounded men rose up to fight bravely by your side. An hour in which your reputation became fixed with those men. You are a priestess, yes, and no one shall question that. But you are a leader in whom men and women find courage and confidence. That means that time will arise when you shall be needed to lead soldiers. Times will come when you are called on to stand at the fore and command. I only ask that you be prepared for those times. Sard concluded his lecture. Bricklenuts, said Debrina under her breath. A few days after signing the new treaty, General Chunk had a little accident and drowned. There's nothing special about that. Goblins plot murders every day,